I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. At Tuesday's House Judiciary Subcommittee hearing, Congressman Tom McClintock spoke about President James Madison. Madison believed the most important provision in the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war, not the president. McClintock asked witnesses if there is any conceivable occasion, other than a surprise attack, where the president should be able to invoke extraordinary powers without the consent of Congress. Let's listen in for their responses.
Now, patiently waiting, but I'm sure with great questions and insight, Mr. McClintock.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for a truly nonpartisan hearing on a very, very important subject. James Madison said that, in his opinion, the single most important provision in the Constitution was a provision that gave the power to declare war to Congress and not to the president. And the reason for that was simply that war enhances the power of the president enormously, and therefore it creates an obvious perverse incentive if the president is to declare war. It follows that any measure that enhances the president's power should not be in the hands of the president, human beings being what we are. We kind of, in the words of the great philosopher Jack Handy, in a former life I must have been a great king because I really like it when people do what I tell them to. That's just in our nature. There was a discussion at the convention with respect to the wording of that clause. It was originally giving Congress the power to make war solely, and that was changed from make to declare for concern that the president should have some power inherent to repel an immediate invasion before Congress could make a declaration. December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. December 8th, 1941, the president appears before a joint session of the Congress. In that speech, he says, "As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense." FDR understood that beyond those immediate acts, he could not take any offensive act without the declaration of war by the Congress, which was then forthcoming. The reason I recount all of this is to ask, is there any conceivable occasion, other than a surprise attack, where the president should be able to invoke extraordinary powers without the consent of Congress? Oh, I'll start with Mr. Giancarlo, Mr.
Canaparo.
Thank you.
My name tag has disappeared, so I apologize for that. So I am generally skeptical of the argument that the president has inherent powers that are beyond those articulated by Article 2. I think you hit the discussion about the attack on Pearl Harbor sort of illustrates how this is supposed to go. Certainly, as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, the president has certain powers attendant to that constitutional directive. The power to, for instance, defend the country from an invasion or a hostile attack is certainly inherent in his role as Commander-in-Chief, but that's
and
not
very limited to repelling an attack, not initiating an attack on his own. My question is there any circumstance, conceivable circumstance, where the president should be able to invoke powers on his own authority?
powers separate from these attendant to being Commander-in-Chief?
Well, I'm speaking more broadly of any pandemic, for example. Why would the president be given authority to acquire extraordinary powers on his own say without the consent of Congress? It seems to me that that is the proper role of the decision-making branch of the United States government.
Thank you. In general, yes. The problem we're operating from right now, though, is that over the last 100 years or so, Congress has delegated to him so much power.
Yes, well, maybe
already.
we should try to undelegate all of those powers. My question is there any conceivable circumstance, I'll throw it open to any of the panelists, where the president should have that authority?
I would argue that we have to look at the circumstance. The president wouldn't even have to ask for the authorities. He would just assume, I use the term assumed inherent powers. So let's take real world cases.
Well, I mean, the president can assume the power to stop the tide from coming in, but that doesn't make it right or
I understand
realistic.
that.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't give it any authority.
But my point is, and Miller's point was, that the president will act regardless of whether you give him authority or not, and that is the problem. It's often said that the president has two.
Well, doesn't the Constitution prevent that? I mean, the Constitution is a separation of powers. It's mother's rule writ large. Mother has two hungry sons, one slice of pie. How does mother slice the pie so both of them are satisfied? One slices, the other chooses. That's the constitutional separation of powers. One brother appropriates funds but can't spend them. The other spends funds but can't appropriate them. One brother makes law but can't enforce it. The other enforces law but cannot make it. One brother can declare war but can't wage it. The other can wage war but not declare it. That's a self-correcting mechanism. I'm out of time now, but it seems to me that it is time that Congress restored that balance, which is at the center of the constitutional architecture that keeps us free and keeps the Constitution self-enforcing. Again, there's no penalty for violating the Constitution because the Constitution is supposed to be a self-enforcing document. And the only way that works is if the separation of powers is maintained. We've blurred that separation of powers and I think put at risk the entire architecture of our Constitution. I yield back.
Benjamin Franklin had a very cryptic remark to that. He said there are only two ways that you can actually control a president, and that's either to impeach him or assassinate him. And this is the problem when you get into, let's say, a biological attack, is where I looked at it, and also a nuclear attack. Events move so quickly. If a normal event, we can go through this process. But what happens, given the circumstances that we were talking about with President Carr at the beginning, where we have 15 or 20 minutes to make decisions, or let's say a smallpox attack hits, and we have to make decisions almost instantly about who gets inoculated and who doesn't get inoculated, all these kinds of things, that's when we get into this very dangerous territory.
Thank you. I just quickly wanted to jump in on what Mr. McCleary was saying and say that it may be the case in some situations where presidents are going to act on the spur of the moment very quickly, and it may be a situation where they think it's an existential threat, and they're not necessarily going to limit themselves to what the law says or what the Constitution says. What used to happen in this country, and Professor Prakash discusses this in his article when that happened, is the president would act, but he would acknowledge that he had acted in haste and perhaps outside the bounds of the Constitution in order to try to preserve the nation, and he would go to Congress to try to get some kind of ratification for that. He would not pretend that his actions had been authorized by the Constitution. What happens today is that presidents assume that anything that they think is necessary for the preservation of the nation must therefore be authorized under Article 2. It doesn't work that way. And I think the system we had in place earlier, where the limitations of the Constitution were acknowledged, and where if a president stepped outside the bounds, everyone acknowledged that the president stepped outside the bounds. If it was considered in retrospect to be something that was beneficial for the nation, Congress would step in and ratify it, would pass legislation indemnifying the actors, for example. But to say anything that in the moment the president feels that he or she must do, by definition is therefore constitutional, that's backwards and it's very dangerous.
Thank you.